If you thought Julian Hart was the most dangerous man in this story, you were wrong. The man who started everything never even worked at Cross Enterprises. He just watched from the outside while his brother did the dirty work, and by the time anyone thought to look for him, he'd already disappeared. This is part 2, and it is going to change everything you thought you knew about part 1. Hi family, if you've watched the first part of the story, welcome to part 2, and if you are new here, you are in for a ride. Check out part 1 of this story to know the depth. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching. Let's go. The trap was elegant. Damian announced he was stepping down as CEO due to personal scandal, naming Julian as interim replacement. Julian took the bait, arriving at Cross Enterprises headquarters with barely contained triumph. He walked into the boardroom expecting victory and found federal agents instead. Julian Hart, you're under arrest for attempted murder, corporate espionage, and embezzlement. When Julian's mask finally came off in that boardroom, it didn't come off gradually. It collapsed all at once, the way a structure fails when the single load-bearing wall gives way. One moment he was the composed, charming COO who'd spent 9 years performing loyalty. The next, he was just a man standing in a room full of federal prosecutors, with nowhere left to hide and nothing left to protect. Damian had watched it happen from across the table and felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Not the clean relief of a threat neutralized. Something more complicated, something that sat uncomfortably in his chest and refused to be categorized. Because before Julian had been the enemy, he'd been the closest thing to a brother Damian had ever known. And that didn't disappear simply because it had been built on a lie. Julian Hart, Damian said, his voice quiet in the way that had always been more dangerous than shouting. Or should I call Daniel too? He's currently being arrested at his apartment in Busan. Julian's smile fell. Not slowly. All at once. What was underneath wasn't what Damian had braced himself for. He'd expected rage, or cold calculation, or the particular contempt of someone who'd been caught, but still believed they were smarter than everyone in the room. What he found instead was grief. The deep, structural kind that had been load-bearing for so long it had become indistinguishable from the person carrying it. Your father called me family, Julian said. His voice was raw in a way Damian had never heard from him. At your graduation. In front of everyone. He put his hand on my shoulder the same way he put it on yours and said I was his son by choice. He stopped. Started again. And then he died and left everything to blood. Just blood. Like those 4 years meant nothing. Like I was staff they'd been generous to. My father loved you, Damian said. Your father pitied me. There's a difference. Julian's joy tightened. And I watched you inherit everything he built. Everything. Without ever having to fight for a single day of it. While Daniel couldn't even get an interview at the company that owed everything to our father's labor. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Our father worked himself to death inside your father's factory. Did you know that? He died at 51. Stress-induced heart attack. Your father sent flowers to the funeral. The room was completely silent. Even the prosecutors had gone still. Damian didn't speak for a long moment. He was thinking about a man he'd never met who died too young in a factory that had made his own family rich. He was thinking about how grief, when it has nowhere to go, eventually becomes something else entirely. So it was Daniel, Damian said finally. He designed it. He designed it. I executed it. We built it together the way we built everything. Together. Julian straightened slightly, some last fragment of dignity reasserting itself. The plan was clean. The waitress was supposed to claim something, get paid, and disappear. You were supposed to be finished. Unmarriageable. Unreliable. A liability the board would force out. His voice broke completely. Instead, you got a family. Even your disasters turned to gold. You're wrong. Damian's voice was quiet, but absolute. That night wasn't a disaster. Luna isn't a disaster. The only disaster is what you did to yourself building this. Julian had nothing left to say to that. The prosecutors moved, and he went with them without resistance, which was somehow worse than if he'd fought. At the door, he stopped. He turned back, and his expression had shifted into something different. Not bitter. Resigned. One more thing, he said. Ethan Pierce. He's been on my payroll for 3 years. watching Sienna, reporting her movements, monitoring who she talked to. He didn't fall in love with her by accident. He got close to her because I paid him to. He paused. And right now, he's alone with your daughter. The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Damian was moving. He called Sienna on his way to the elevator. No answer. He called Maya while running through the lobby. She's resting. Ethan took Luna for ice cream while she sleeps off the pain medication. Everything that had seemed like heroism now looked different under this new light. The rescue at the crash site, Ethan appearing at exactly the right moment. The proposal that had come at exactly the right time, perfectly calibrated to Sienna's most vulnerable moment. The steady presence that had never asked for anything because it didn't need to ask. It was already positioned exactly where it needed to be. Ethan Pierce had not been a hero. He'd been the contingency plan. Across the city, Sienna woke from pain medication into a silence that felt wrong before she was conscious enough to understand why. The specific quality of the quiet, the absence of Luna's presence, which even sleeping was something she could feel. Luna. She moved through the apartment faster than her body was ready for, the medication still heavy in her system. The rooms were empty. On the kitchen counter, a note in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Took Luna for ice cream. Back soon. Her phone rang before she'd finished reading it. Where's Luna? Damian's voice was controlled in the way that meant the control was costing him. Ethan took her for ice. The understanding arrived before the sentence could finish. It moved through her like cold water. Oh God. Damian, he took her. The airstrip was 30 minutes outside Seoul, private, the kind of facility that existed for people with money and reasons to move without documentation. Damian's security team had it surrounded in under 20 minutes, but 20 minutes was long enough for Ethan to be standing near a small plane with Luna's hand in his. Luna was crying with the silent, exhausted kind of crying that happens when a child has run out of the louder kind. She'd been crying long enough that she was past sound. Just tears running down her face with the quiet persistence of someone who hadn't given up but had run out of energy to make noise about it. Don't come closer. Ethan's voice cracked on the second word. He was not performing composure. He didn't have any left. I don't want to hurt her. I am not going to hurt her. Then let her go, Damian said. He stood at the perimeter line with both hands visible and empty, every negotiation instinct he'd spent years developing overridden by something much older and more fundamental. Ethan, look at me. Let her go. I can't. Everything on Ethan's face was visible now, every layer stripped away by the reality of what he was doing and what it meant. Julian has evidence that I falsified research data 3 years ago. It wasn't significant data. Nothing that hurt anyone. A methodology shortcut on a grant application, the kind that happens in every lab under deadline pressure. But it's enough. Enough to end my career, my license, everything I've built. He looked down at Luna, and what was on his face when he looked at her was not the face of someone executing a plan. It was the face of someone who had fallen in love with a child over the course of 4 years and was now standing on an airstrip holding her hand and understanding exactly what kind of person that made him. I told myself it was just a job, he said, not to Damian, not to the security team, but mostly to the space between himself and what he'd become. I told myself that as long as I was the one watching, Julian wouldn't send someone worse. I told myself I was a shield. He stopped. Luna looked up at him with her father's eyes and said nothing. She'd stopped asking to go home. She'd stopped asking for her mother. She was just looking at him with the particular expression of a 5-year-old who has understood something that grown adults spend years avoiding. Ethan. Sienna's voice came from behind Damian. She'd come through the security perimeter without asking permission, and 2 agents had moved to intercept her, and Damian had let her go because he understood, in that moment, that she was the only person on this airstrip who could reach him. She walked forward alone, across the tarmac, until she was close enough that he could see her face clearly. I know you loved us, she said. I could feel it. Real love doesn't perform the way yours did. The way you were with Luna when she was sick, the way you stayed late when I was struggling with the grant application, the way you looked at her when she called you Dr. Ethan. That wasn't performance. I know the difference. It wasn't. His grip on Luna's hand loosened slightly. Not after the first month. Not once I actually knew you both. I'm not the person who said yes to Julian. I don't know how to make you believe that. You prove it the way everyone proves anything, Sienna said. You do the right thing when it's the hardest option available. Julian's already in custody, Damian said from behind her. Daniel is in custody in Busan. The evidence Julian has been holding over you is now part of a federal investigation. He has no power to release anything. He doesn't have power over anyone anymore. Ethan stood there for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually do. Then Luna tugged her hand free from his. Not hard. Not with panic. Just the quiet, decisive motion of a child who has made up her mind. She walked to Sienna and wrapped both arms around her mother's legs and pressed her face into Sienna's dress, and she didn't look back. Ethan's empty hand hung at his side. I really did love you both, he said. For whatever that's worth now. It's worth something, Sienna said. Her voice was steady. It's just not enough. The agents came forward and Ethan went with them, and he was still crying when they led him to the vehicle, and some of the security team looked away, and some of them didn't. 1 week later, on a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing dramatic about it, Damian sat on Sienna's worn couch and watched Luna color at the coffee table. She'd been quiet since the airstrip. Not the quiet of fear, but the specific quiet of a child processing something that didn't fit into any of the categories she'd built for understanding the world. She was coloring a picture of a house, which she'd been coloring for 3 days without finishing. Luna, Damian said softly. Can I talk to you? She looked up. Her expression was careful in a way that broke something in his chest. Are you going to take me away from Mama? No. He slid off the couch to kneel at her level, the same position he'd been in the night they first met, when she'd run into him and bled on his pocket square and told him he looked like her picture. Never. I promise. Everyone says I promise, Luna said. Dr. Ethan said it too. There was nothing to say to that. She was 5 years old and she was right, and he sat with the truth of it for a moment before speaking. You're right to be careful with promises. You should be. He held her gaze. I know I haven't been your father. I didn't know you existed. But I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere, and if you'll let me try, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know the difference between someone who says a promise and someone who keeps one. Luna considered this with the gravity of a small person who had learned that the world was more complicated than it looked. Daddies are supposed to keep you safe, she said finally. You didn't keep me safe. No, I didn't. I failed you. He didn't qualify it. Didn't explain or minimize. And I can't fix what already happened. But I can show up from now on. Every day. Will you let me try? She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked down at her unfinished coloring. Then back at him. Promise, promise? Not just regular promise. He held out his pinky finger. She studied it. The deliberation of a 5-year-old who has learned to be careful is a specific kind of serious that adults rarely manage. Then she hooked her tiny finger around his. Okay, she said. But you're on probation. Something in Damian's chest nodded completely. He laughed, and it was rusty with disuse and completely genuine, and surprised him as much as it surprised Sienna from the kitchen doorway where she'd been quietly watching. That's fair, he said. I'll try to earn a promotion. Luna looked back down at her coloring. You can sit here, she said, as if granting permission for something she'd already decided. If you want. While I finish this. He sat on the floor beside the coffee table and watched her color and didn't say anything, and that was the beginning of something real. After Luna was asleep that night, Sienna walked Damian to the door and they stood in the hallway where the light was not quite working properly, flickering slightly the way it had been flickering for 3 months because the building manager was slow about repairs. I need to apologize to you, Damian said. Not for what Julian did. I can't apologize for someone else's choices. But for how I handled it when it came out. For showing up at your door with lawyers like you were a hostile acquisition. For not believing you immediately. For 5 years of being absent from a life that was half mine, even though I didn't know it. We were both used, Sienna said. Julian and Daniel built something that used both of us. You don't have to carry the full weight of that. I want to carry some of it. I want to be the kind of person who carries the right things. He paused. I want to know you. Not the terrified version from that night. Not the defensive mother who had every reason to keep her walls up. Just Sienna. The researcher. The person. The woman who kept a secret for 5 years to protect a little girl from a world that would have chewed her up. Sienna leaned against the doorframe. That's going to take time. I'm not going to pretend it's going to be simple. I don't want simple, he said. Simple isn't interesting. She almost smiled. Almost. You're going to have to be patient. I've been running a company for 9 years with a traitor in my inner circle and didn't notice. I think I can manage patient. He held out his hand formally. Hi, I'm Damian Cross. I'm a workaholic CEO who just discovered he has a brilliant daughter, and she has an even more brilliant mother, and I'm hoping they'll both give me a chance to prove I'm worth the trouble. Sienna looked at the offered hand. Then she shook it. Hi, I'm Sienna Vale. Medical researcher, single mother, and someone who recently discovered that not all billionaires are heartless. The jury's still out on you specifically, but the preliminary evidence is promising. The handshake lingered. Neither of them moved to end it. 3 days after that, Damian walked into the Cross Enterprises emergency board meeting and sat at the head of the table where he'd always sat and looked at the 12 people who'd spent the last 2 weeks questioning whether he should remain CEO, and said nothing for a long enough moment that the silence became uncomfortable. You asked me to prove why I deserve to lead this company, he said finally. Here's your proof. I identified a threat that had been embedded in our leadership for 9 years. A threat that had access to our financials, our strategy, our board relationships, our most sensitive internal information. I built a trap using that threat's own ambition as the mechanism. I executed it in coordination with federal investigators without a single leak, without tipping our hand, and without giving Julian Hart a single reason to suspect what was coming until he was already in the room with prosecutors. He let that sit for a moment. Our stock has recovered. It has gained 8% since Hart's arrest. 3 contracts that were stalled during the scandal have been confirmed. The company is more stable today than it was 3 months ago. He looked around the table. Questions? Nobody spoke. Good. One more item. My daughter, Luna Crossvale, is my legal heir. This is now reflected in my will and in the corporate charter. Any succession arrangements that previously directed controlling shares to the COO position are void, effective immediately. He stood. Anyone who has a problem with any of this is welcome to tender their resignation. I'll accept it without prejudice. No one moved. No one spoke. The meeting was over. In Busan, in a holding facility that was clean and functional and deeply unpleasant in the way that all holding facilities are, Daniel Hart sat across a metal table from a federal investigator and tried to calculate what was left to protect. The answer, which took him about 40 minutes of mental accounting to arrive at, was nothing. Julian had been his only real asset, and Julian had talked in the boardroom in ways that made Daniel's position legally indefensible regardless of what he said or didn't say now. The investigator was a patient woman named Agent Cho who had been doing this for 15 years and had developed the particular skill of asking the same question in different ways until the person across the table ran out of versions of the answer. Tell me about the night at the Eclipse Club, she said. From the beginning. Daniel looked at the metal table for a long moment. Then he started talking. He talked for 4 hours. He talked about the night their father died and about watching Julian get promoted inside the company that had refused to interview Daniel, and about the whiskey and the accumulated resentment and the conversation where what had started as anger became a plan. He talked about identifying Sienna Vale as the woman who would be easiest to position, a woman who needed money, who was invisible in the way service workers are invisible, who could be made to disappear if everything went right or discredited if it went wrong. He talked about the approach that hadn't worked, the revised approach that had, and the 5 years of quiet panic that followed when Sienna had run instead of staying to play the role he'd written for her. Agent Cho listened to all of it without expression. At the end, she said, "You understand that nothing you've said changes your legal exposure." "I know," Daniel said. "Then why tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the girl is 5 years old," he said finally. "And she didn't have anything to do with any of this. And I want there to be a record somewhere that says what actually happened. So that when she's old enough to read it, she knows it wasn't her fault. It wasn't her mother's fault. None of it was about them. He stopped. It was about us. About two brothers who decided that resentment was the same as justice. It wasn't. Agent Cho wrote something in her notes. Is there anything else? Tell Damian Cross, Daniel said, that our father's name was Park Jae-won. He worked in the Cross factory for 22 years. Damian's father knew his name. I'd like Damian to know it too. Agent Cho wrote it down. 6 months after the boardroom and the airstrip and the hallway conversation where neither of them had let go of the handshake for longer than was strictly professional, Sienna stood in the Cross Foundation gala venue and watched Damian teach Luna how to work a room. She watched him kneel down to Luna's level to explain something, watched Luna nod with the seriousness of a student receiving important information, watched her then march confidently toward a group of foundation donors and introduce herself with the precise formality of a child who had been practicing. Good evening, I'm Luna Crossvale. My father's company supports the research that's going to cure cancer. The donors had absolutely no idea how to respond to this, which was fine, because Luna didn't really need them to. 6 months of Sunday dinners. 6 months of Damian arriving with food from places that intimidated Sienna with their prices and Luna eating it with the frank pleasure of a child who judged meals on flavor rather than origin. 6 months of homework helped that somehow involved Damian learning more about second-grade mathematics than he had known at any point in his adult life. 6 months of Luna calling him dad with the casual certainty of a child who decided a thing and was done revisiting it, and Damian excusing himself to the bathroom on at least 3 separate occasions that Sienna had counted. 6 months of Sienna's research receiving full funding, reviewed blind, approved on merit, which she'd made an explicit condition of accepting anything connected to his name, and which he'd agreed to without argument because he was learning which battles were won by not fighting them. 6 months of building something real. Carefully, from materials that were honest, in the space between two people who had every reason to be cautious and were choosing, deliberately, to be brave instead. When Damian took the podium that night, the room quieted the way rooms always did for him, with the immediate attention of people who understood instinctively that this was someone worth listening to. He stood there for a moment without speaking, and Sienna, standing near the back with Maya, felt something shift in the quality of the silence. Last year, he said, a photograph taken in this room nearly destroyed my company and my reputation. It also gave me the greatest gift of my life. My daughter. He paused. And it brought me to a woman who showed me what real strength looks like. What it costs to protect someone you love when the whole world is arranged against you. What it means to build something good out of something that was designed to destroy. He found Sienna across the room. The distance between them was maybe 30 feet, but the way he looked at her made it feel like no distance at all. Sienna Vale, he said. Would you come up here? She had known him for 6 months by then, which was long enough to know that Damian Cross did not make public gestures without purpose. The walk across the room was the longest 30 feet she'd ever covered, aware of every eye tracking her, her legs not entirely reliable, her heart doing something complicated behind her ribs. He took her hand when she reached him. Then he went to one knee, and the room made a sound like a single breath drawn simultaneously by everyone in it. I'm not good at this, he said. He looked up at her, and what was on his face was the least guarded she had ever seen him, the CEO entirely absent and just a man present in his place. I'm good at strategy, at identifying threats and eliminating them, at building things that last. This is different. This is just me asking you if you'll let me spend the rest of my life earning the trust you shouldn't have had to give me twice. The trust you gave me anyway, because that's who you are. He stopped, took a breath. Sienna, will you marry me? From somewhere in the crowd, clear and bright and carrying the absolute certainty of a 5-year-old who had already decided how this was going to go, say yes, mama. I already told him it was okay. The room erupted. Sienna was crying and nodding and entirely unable to produce words, which was its own kind of answer. Damian looked up at her with something on his face that she realized she'd been watching develop for 6 months, something that had started as guilt and obligation and become something that had no name except the obvious one. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and stood and kissed her while the room applauded and the cameras flashed, and this time the photographs told a different story. This time they were writing the ending themselves, in the same room where a different photograph had started everything, and the symmetry of it was the kind that felt intentional even though it wasn't. Luna found them before they'd finished the kiss. She pushed through the crowd with the determination of a child on a mission and wrapped her arms around both of them at once, which required some logistical creativity given the height difference, and said into the general region of their midsections, "I said yes too. Nobody asked me, but I said yes anyway." Damian looked down at his daughter, this 5-year-old person who had his eyes and her mother's courage and her own particular fierceness that belonged to nobody but herself, and laughed with the full, unguarded sound of someone who had not laughed like that in years and had forgotten what it felt like. They left the gala with Luna between them, holding both their hands, her purple dress catching the light as she walked with the confidence of a child who knew exactly where she belonged and with whom. Sienna looked up at the night sky above Seoul, at the particular dark between the city lights, and let herself understand the shape of the journey. It had started with 2 brothers and a night of whiskey and accumulated resentment. It had moved through 9 years of quiet planning and 1 terrible night of smoke and drugs and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. It had traveled through 5 years of survival and 1 photograph and lawyers and a DNA test and a car with cut brakes and an airstrip with a crying man and a child who had to learn, too young, that not everyone who says I love you means it the same way. And it had arrived here. At this street. At this man. At this child between them who was already explaining to anyone who would listen that her daddy was on probation, but was doing pretty well so far. Sometimes the worst beginnings made the strongest things. Sometimes the people you needed were on the other side of the worst year of your life, and the only way to reach them was to survive it. Sometimes the woman someone had been looking for, without knowing they were looking, had been running from them for good reasons, and the work of becoming worthy of her trust was harder and more important than anything they'd ever built. Damian Cross had built an empire. He had built something harder now. Something that had required him to be undone first and rebuilt differently, to be the kind of person a 5-year-old would put on probation and mean as a compliment. It was worth it. Every single piece of it had been worth it. If you've made it to the end of both parts of this story, drop a comment right now telling us the moment you realized Julian Hart was the one who'd started everything, because some of you caught it in part 1 and some of you just had your minds blown. If you watched both parts of this story all the way to the end, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that the people worth fighting for are worth every difficult thing that comes before you find them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.